Hello there, dear listener. Welcome. You're here now, and that's more than enough. There's nothing you need to do, no tasks to finish, no thoughts to hold on to. Just lie back, make yourself comfortable, and let your breath settle into something soft and natural. Tonight we're going to step gently into the foggy corners of the past. We're not looking for kings or battles, not for glory or grandeur. Number. We're going to spend time with someone history often forgets, or only remembers in whispers, the medieval assassin. But not the kind you might imagine in stories. This is not a tale of flashing daggers or swift escapes. There's no rush, just the slow, wandering picture of what life might have truly felt like for someone living at the shadowed edge of society, 14th century Europe. Someone who moved quietly, watched carefully, and lived in the space between power and poverty. It wasn't a glorious life. In fact, it kind of sucked. But in all the little ways that history rarely writes down, the cold draft in the rented attic, the heavy boots worn too long, the watery game that never quite satisfied, the rituals of blending in. So come along, if you'd like. Let's take a sleepy little walk through cobbled streets, faded alleyways, flickering candlelight. We'll take our time. And if you drifted off before we finish, the man with the patched cloak leaning near the stone wall of the chapel, his hands tucked in the folds of his tunic. He's not hiding, just not being noticed. The sweet figure eyes like slime, especially in days like this. He's there, quiet, watching. His name is recorded in chronicles. Tied to the land, with legacy of coins and children manuscripts. But he lived for a time. We'll call him Thomas. Well, it probably wasn't his name. It's just soft on the tongue. Thomas woke most mornings still in the cold. The attic room he rented above a candlemaker shop was small, barely wide enough for the narrow cot and indented chest. He kept his things in. Rats were common. He didn't mind much. They were quieter than the candlemaker's apprentice, who snored thunderously till the floor was the cot sagged slightly. The straw mattress slogged flatly. He slept on his side, curled like a cat. His boots propped against the doorposts, like those of a dry tent. Boots. They were always there. No matter how many times he tried them by the heart, the small tavern where he took supper. Leather surrendered its resistance to moisture. Rainwater soaked the quickly. But he wore them anyway. The second pair was too expensive. It was important to him, but not too important. Suspicion from those who seemed out of place. As Thomas rose before the sun had fully shaken the darkness, Thomas. The bell in the distant cathedral would toll a slow, solitary note, just one. A sound that felt like a breath held too long. Pull on his cloak, fasten the wooden clasp, and step out into streets still glistening from dew or last night's rain. The city smelled of wet wood, burning peat and cabbage. Always cabbage. The quietest hours were the safest. The bakers had not yet opened their shutters, and the watchmen had finished their rounds. The only figures about were tradesfolk setting up stalls, a monk sweeping the stones in front of a chapel, and the occasional cart rumbling by with wheels creaking under their weight. Thomas didn't walk quickly. He never did. Quickness drew attention. Instead, he
shuffled with the practice gait of some unforgettable. Moving, a little slouching. It was harder work than Ethan thought, pretending to inwardly notice. And what did he eat? Bread, mostly. Coarse thin bread with thick crust and very little flavor. Sometimes a rind of cheese, hard enough to cut your lip if you weren't careful. He'd had a profitable task recently, more profitable than cook stewed beans. The meat was rare and usually salted to the point of dryness. He drank weak ale that was safe within water. It was cloudy, sometimes sour, often served lukewarm, but full of belly. And on quiet evenings, with a group drawn over the bench near the fire, Thomas could almost forget the weight of what he did for food. Almost. Thomas liked to sit at the far end of the tavern.
Not in the corner, that was too obvious, but just near the back. One bench from the fire. The kind of place where the smoke from the hearth was thick enough to soften outlines, and the candlelight didn't quite reach. It wasn't a hiding spot, just a comfortably overlooked one. The tavern was called the Bent Pike, though the sign outside had long since faded and hung crooked on rusted hinges. It was more of a place for traders and carters than anything else. Not a noble's haunt. No musicians played here, and no one danced. The ale was sour, the benches uneven, and the stew had bits in it, best not inspected too closely. But it was reliable, quiet, warm. That was worth something. By the time Thomas arrived, the regulars would already be nursing their mugs. Men with leathery hands, soot-streaked faces, and the weary tilt of shoulders, too used to lifting things that didn't want to be lifted. No one asked questions here. You paid your coin, nodded once, and you were left alone. Thomas always ordered the same thing: a cup of small ale and a bowl of whatever stew they'd been boiling since morning. He never asked what was in it. It was hot. That was enough. While he ate, he listened. He didn't look like he was listening, of course. His posture suggested distraction, or perhaps dullness. He stirred his stew slowly, watching it as though deciphering some mystery in the shape of the onions. But his ears caught everything. The barkeep complaining about tax collectors, the young apprentice mumbling about his master's temper, a merchant whispering of wagons gone missing on the northern road. Little things, harmless things. But every scrap of talk painted a bigger picture. Every loose word helped him understand the town's rhythm, the pulse of its people. That was important. Knowing the rhythm. Because to move without drawing notice, you had to move with the flow of the place. If everyone rose at dawn and you walked at noon, you'd stand out. If the market was closed for feast day and you asked about fish, you'd be remembered. So Thomas made it his business to know the subtle patterns. When the baker's wife took down the shutters, when the priests changed guard at the chapel, which streets the watchman avoided on rainy nights. It wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting, but essential. He had a small book, kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his rented attic. Nothing grand, just a leather-bound ledger with pages yellowed by candle smoke. In it, he scribbled little notes with a bit of charcoal, symbols only he understood. A drawn loop might mean a noble had left town. 3 dots in a row might mean a stable boy had been asking questions. He didn't write names. Names were dangerous. Nights were long. There was a kind of loneliness that came not from being unloved, but from being unknowable. Thomas felt that. Not always, but often, when he lay on his cot, and listened to the wind rattle the shutter, or when he heard laughter drifting up from the streets and knew he couldn't be part of it, not safely. He wasn't hated, but he didn't belong either. And belonging was dangerous for men like him. There was a woman once, Inez, her name had been. She sold ribbons from a cart by the market square. Her hair always had a faint scent of rosemary, and she laughed like someone who didn't mind being heard. For a time, Thomas would linger near her stall. Sometimes he bought a ribbon, sometimes not. Once she asked his name. He said it was Jakob. She smiled. But he didn't return after that, because what would he say? That his work involved knowing which guards slept too soundly and which door hinges creaked the least? That he earned coin from letters passed through hands that never wanted to meet? There were nights he thought of her, nights he imagined her cart closed for the evening, her hands curled around a bowl of soup, her hair tied back with one of her own ribbons. A small, safe life. It seemed impossibly far from his. So he returned to his cot, to the lump of straw that poked through the thin cloth, to the sloped ceiling that pressed in from above, to the slow drip of rainwater that collected in a bucket near the foot of his bed, to his boots lined up by the hearth standing. The tools of his trade were inconvenient, contrary to fanciful tales. An assassin didn't carry gleaming daggers strapped on with sheaths. Number Thomas's tools were things that could be explained and found. A belt knife that could travel with a curved awl, useful for mending shoes. A pouch of finely ground herbs that could serve as seasoning or something else in the right measure. He had a small needle, barely longer than a finger joint, dipped in oils made from belladonna and henbane. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, but it was quiet. Everything had to be easy, which would discover. Fire alarm, too still, too loud. If he wore too much black, he'd be feared. Either way, people would look twice. And looking twice was what he avoided at all costs. So he wore layers of faded wool, a cap pulled low in daylight. He rubbed soot into the seams of his garments to dull his his boots remarkable. His face was practiced dullness. He avoided smiling too widely or scowling too deeply. A face you couldn't quite describe. That, in the end, was the point. Not to be invisible, just forgettable. Thomas didn't set out to become what he was. Few ever did. He wasn't born to it. Wasn't trained from childhood in some noble order of shadows. That sort of thing made for pretty stories. But real life was quieter, messier, and far less deliberate. It had started, as many things did, with hunger. He had been 15 when the bad harvest came. Not that any harvest had been particularly good before that, but this one was worse. Blighted barley, spoiled roots, and sheep that coughed and fell over before winter had even begun. Tomas's father had been a cooper. Not a bad trade in better years. But no one needed barrels when there was nothing to store. The wood warped in the damp, and coins grew scarce. His mother, tired and hollow-cheeked, had tried to stretch thin stew across too many bowls. And so, one gray morning, Thomas had walked out of the village with a sack over his shoulder and nothing in his pocket. The city swallowed him. And in the city he found something strange, a kind of quiet kindness offered not by priests or merchants, but by an older man named Bartle. Bartle wore a crooked hat and smelled faintly of linseed oil. He sold ink and paper, he said, but he also knew things. When the guards changed posts, which doors weren't locked, and which windows could be climbed without drawing notice. He never asked why Thomas had wandered into his shop 3 days in a row without buying anything. He just offered bread. And one evening, a question. Do you want to learn how not to be noticed? It wasn't an invitation. It was more like a warning wrapped in an offer. Thomas had nodded, and Bartol had smiled in that tired, sideways way people do when they know a hard road is being chosen. Training didn't happen in some hidden stone chamber lit by flickering torches. Number. It happened behind the shop, in a dusty courtyard between two leaning buildings, beneath a clothesline that always dripped on rainy days. Bartol taught him how to move, in rhythm with the world, never against it. Watch the candle, Bartol would say. And Thomas would stare at a stub of wax in a tin cup, flame swaying gently with each draft of wind. He was told to move only when the flame bent. That way, the sound of a footstep might be swallowed by the breeze, the shifting of a wall, the creak of an old sign overhead. He was told to chew mint leaves before speaking with strangers. Not to cover his breath, though that helped, but because it made him seem common, like a stable hand or a page boy, someone unimportant. He learned how to yawn with his mouth closed, how to scratch his cheek while observing a door, and how to cough to cover the sound of a hidden latch sliding open. None of it was fast or dramatic. It was tedious, repetitive, and strangely meditative. An amateur rushes, Bartol muttered once, while rolling a small ball of wax in his fingers. But if you take your time, you can slip through a world full of locked doors without ever using a key. Thomas was never given a badge, or a symbol, or a secret tattoo. That sort of thing was for stories. No one initiated him with a dagger held to the moonlight. No solemn oaths, no velvet robes, no hidden hall beneath the city square. Instead, there were only rules, spoken once, never repeated, and always remembered. Rule 1, if someone remembers your face, you did it wrong. Rule 2, never work where you eat. Rule 3, coin is fine, but favors are better. Rule 4, the best exit is the one you entered through. Simple, forgettable in the best way. But they shaped everything. Thomas would never know how many others lived by those same rules. Perhaps none, perhaps hundreds. There were no meetings, no shared codes, no knowing nods across crowded taverns. If you saw someone who might be like you looked away. Safety was in the loneliness. That was what most people didn't understand. This wasn't a brotherhood, it was a craft, a quiet, often miserable craft. And those who practiced it survived by being singular, invisible, and solitary. He avoided smiling too widely or scowling too deeply. A face you couldn't quite describe. That, in the end, was the point. Not to be invisible, just forgettable. Thomas didn't set out to become what he was. Few ever did. He wasn't born to it. He wasn't trained from childhood in some noble order of shadows. That sort of thing made for pretty stories, but real life was quieter, messier, far less deliberate. It had started, as many things did, with hunger. He had been 15 when the bad harvest came. Not that any harvest had been particularly good before that, but this one was worse. Blighted barley, spoiled roots, and sheep that coughed and fell over before winter had even begun. Thomas's father had been a cooper, not a bad trade in better years. But no one needed barrels when there was nothing to store. The wood warped in the damp, and coins grew scarce. His mother, tired and hollow-cheeked, had tried to stretch thin stew across too many bowls. And so, one gray morning, Thomas had walked out of the village with a sack over his shoulder and nothing in his pocket. The city swallowed him. And in the city he found something strange, a kind of quiet kindness offered not by priests or merchants, but by an older man named Bartol. Bartol wore a crooked hat and smelled faintly of linseed oil. He sold ink and paper, he said, but he also knew things. When the guards changed posts, which doors weren't locked, and which windows could be climbed without drawing notice. He never asked why Tomas had wandered into his shop 3 days in a row without buying anything. He just offered bread, and one evening, a question. Do you want to learn how not to be noticed? It wasn't an invitation. It was more like a warning wrapped in an offer. Tomas had nodded, and Bartol had smiled in that tired, sideways way people do when they know a hard road is being chosen. Training didn't happen in some hidden stone chamber lit by flickering torches. It happened behind the shop, in a dusty courtyard between two leaning buildings, beneath a clothesline that always dripped on rainy days. Bartol taught him how to move in rhythm with the world, never against it. "Watch the candle," Bartol would say. And Tomas would stare at a stub of wax in a tin cup, flame swaying gently with each draft of wind. He was told to move only when the flame bent. That way the sound of a footstep might be swallowed by the breeze, the shifting of a wall, the creak of an old sign overhead. He was told to chew mint leaves before speaking with strangers. Not to cover his breath, though that helped, but because it made him seem common, like a stable hand or a page boy, someone unimportant. He learned how to yawn with his mouth closed, how to scratch his cheek while observing a door, and how to cough to cover the sound of a hidden latch sliding open. None of it was fast or dramatic. It was tedious, repetitive, and strangely meditative. "An amateur rushes," Bartol muttered once, while rolling a small ball of wax in his fingers. But if you take your time, you can slip through a world full of locked doors without ever using a key. Thomas was never given a badge, or a symbol, or a secret tattoo. That sort of thing was for stories. No one initiated him with a dagger held to the moonlight. No solemn oaths, no velvet robes, no hidden hall beneath the city square. Instead, there were only rules, spoken once, never repeated, and always remembered. Rule 1, if someone remembers your face, you did it wrong. Rule 2, never work where you eat. Rule 3, coin is fine, but favors are better. Rule 4, the best exit is the one you entered through. Simple, forgettable in the best way. But they shaped everything. Thomas would never know how many others lived by those same rules. Perhaps none, perhaps hundreds. There were no meetings, no shared codes, no knowing nods across crowded taverns. If you saw someone who might be like you looked away. Safety was in the loneliness. That was what most people didn't understand. This wasn't a brotherhood. It was a craft. A quiet, often miserable craft. And those who practiced it survived by being singular, invisible, and solitary, which, as you might imagine, could get very cold. Some nights Thomas would lie awake, eyes fixed on the sloped ceiling above him, and feel the peculiar weight of his own nothingness. He didn't own anything worth stealing. He had no name that mattered, no kin who might claim him, no story anyone would tell when he was gone. And yet, he knew the names of at least 20 merchants in town, the favorite bakery of a local bishop, the backdoor habits of a knight's mistress, and how to enter the apothecary's cellar without ever rattling the latch. He was full of other people's lives, but he had none of his own. Sometimes that made the world feel far away, like he was watching it through fogged glass. People laughed, bargained, shouted in the square. And Thomas drifted past them like smoke, carrying whispers that weren't his and secrets he didn't want. There were days he envied the tanner's boy with his stained hands and loud voice. Days he wondered what it might feel like to own a dog, or to forget something without consequence. But mostly, he simply moved, one day to the next, one alley to the next, one face to the next. He wasn't happy, but he was alive. And in his trade, that counted for something. Thomas always prepared the night before, not the same night, never so rushed, never so reckless. No, there was always a cushion of time to think, to watch, to listen. Preparation didn't mean polishing weapons or whispering to blades. He wasn't a knight, and he didn't believe in omens. Instead, his tools were simpler, softer, worn from use and faded with familiarity. He'd begin by boiling water. Not for tea, though sometimes he made a weak brew with dried herbs, mild things calming. Lavender if he could get it, or linden blossom. Something to slow the thoughts, to soften the nerves without dulling the senses. He'd pour the hot water into a basin and wash his hands, then his face. Slowly, not out of vanity, but because it grounded him. The warmth, the motion, it brought him into his body, reminded him of his edges. Afterward, he would lay out what he needed on a square of linen cloth. A small piece of twine, a bit of oiled leather, a folded scrap of parchment with a scribbled floor plan, a dull knife, a thimble with a hidden needle tucked inside. Nothing sharp, nothing loud, everything quiet, everything plain. He didn't carry poison often, not because he was above it, but because it was unreliable and messy. Better to leave no trace at all. Sometimes he carried a weighted pouch, not for fighting, but for balance. He wore it around his ankle, tucked beneath the hem of his second layer of clothing. If the job required a climb, he added wax to his fingertips. If it called for waiting, he packed a dried fig. Something small to chew. Something to keep the mind from wandering too far in the dark. These were not the glamorous tools of tales. These were the tools of discomfort, of patience, of preparation. The most important part of any task was not the act itself. It was the watching. Thomas would spend days, sometimes a week, simply observing. He'd become part of the scenery, a beggar one day, a market porter the next. Always near, always distant. He didn't watch the person. He watched the world around them. What time did the baker pull his shutters? When did the lamplighter pass the west gate? Which guards drank too much and leaned when they stood? Thomas had once spent 3 days pretending to mend a saddle on a stoop across from a cloth merchant's home. The saddle wasn't real, and neither was his interest in mending it, but the task gave his hands purpose. It made his presence explainable. The cloth merchant never noticed, but Thomas noticed everything. The way her housekeeper knocked twice before entering, the tiny creak in the hinge of the back gate, the ladder left behind the stables every Thursday after deliveries. Even the stone beneath his feet became familiar. He could close his eyes and feel the tiny slope of the alley, the groove where years of footsteps had worn a dip into the flagstones. It wasn't thrilling work. It was tedious, quiet, and full of stillness, but he trusted the stone more than he trusted any blade, because the stone didn't lie. When it came time to go, Thomas never wore black. That was the first mistake amateurs made. Black was dramatic, black was memorable, and in torchlight, true black gleamed too sharply, like oil on water. No, Thomas wore brown, or gray, or that strange murky green that looked like dried moss after rain. Faded colors, stained cloth, a bit of dust in the seams. The goal wasn't to look like a shadow. The goal was to look like no one. He often layered his clothes, 3 tunics, a half cloak, a loose hood, each removable, each reversible. If he had to move through the city quickly, he could shed a layer, turn a cloak inside out, and become someone else with a few steps and a different stride. He had a way of changing his walk too. A slight limp, a slouch, a tilt of the head, nothing drastic, just enough to blur the memory of him in someone's mind. He carried a walking stick sometimes, not because he needed it, but because it changed his silhouette. And a man with a walking stick was never suspected of climbing over roofs. Little things, boring things. But these were the details that kept him alive. The hardest part was always the waiting, not the climb, not the entrance, not even the exit. Those things required timing, sure. They required calm nerves and flexible knees. But the waiting, that long stretch of silence before the moment, that was where the mind started to drift, to doubt, to remember things it shouldn't. Thomas would sit in the shadows for hours, not moving, breathing slow, hands still, thoughts quiet if he could help it. He sometimes counted in his head, not loudly, not rhythmically, just counted. Steps, heartbeats, the flickers of a candle seen through a shutter, a pattern of raindrops on stone. There was something almost sacred in those quiet hours. Sacred and terribly dull. He didn't think of the person, not their name, not their title, not their face. He thought of the moment after, the walking away. The long, quiet walk through empty alleys, past houses full of sleeping families, past shutters rattling in the wind, past cats perched on fences watching with glowing eyes. That was his reward. Not coin, but the soft hush of escape. The evening had turned cool and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and distant firewood. Thomas walked without direction, his hood pulled low, his hands tucked into his sleeves. He didn't carry anything unusual, just a cloth satchel with a crust of bread, a rolled bit of waxed cloth, and a small coin pouch with fewer coins than it ought to have. He wasn't on a task, not tonight. But he moved like someone who always expected to be forgotten. Step by step, through alley and court, past inns and shuttered shops. The city was not beautiful, not in any showy sense, but it had its textures, cobbled streets worn smooth in the middle, doorways that leaned just slightly from age, iron hinges rusted to the point of squealing, but never quite breaking. 1,000 small, quiet details. Thomas saw them all. Noticed the places where bricks had been replaced with wood. Noted where the rain pooled, where the gutters overflowed, where the lamps burned low or not at all. It wasn't exciting, but it was comforting in a way, like reciting a prayer. A litany of small things, a private map of the unnoticed. In a small side alley near the lime burner's yard, Thomas paused. There was a bakery there, nothing fine, just a fire-warmed room with soot-streaked walls and a crooked sign carved with a wheat stalk. A tiny place where the baker's wife sold misshapen loaves for a half penny, and yesterday's crusts for even less. The scent of scorched rye and soft yeast filled the air. A peaceful, heavy smell. Thomas watched as a boy with one sleeve torn stood awkwardly by the doorway, waiting for the baker to return with change. A dog curled up near the threshold, sighing in its sleep. This wasn't part of a job. There was no hidden motive. Thomas simply watched. He liked this part of the city. It was tired, but not bitter. The walls were close together here, holding the warmth between them. Chimney smoke drifted in thin, lazy strands above the rooftops. It reminded him of something. Not home exactly. He didn't have a clear memory of that anymore, but of safety. The kind found in routine, in steam, in the way the same people made the same mistakes at the same time every day. He moved on, footsteps soft. Near the edge of the merchant's quarter, Thomas passed a pair of men unloading barrels by lantern light. They barely noticed him. That was the point. He paused by a stone post, scratching his ankle idly as if it itched, while his eyes traced the windows above the wine house. That was the home of Aldrich Lavez, a linen importer with suspiciously deep pockets and curiously regular nighttime visitors. Thomas wasn't watching Aldrich tonight. He wasn't paid to care about him, at least not yet. But he was curious. And sometimes, curiosity was a kind of preparation, like sharpening a knife long before you knew which string to cut. He counted the footsteps of a maid moving above, counted again when she moved back. He listened to the pattern of the latch when someone opened the back door. 3 quick turns, and a push with the heel. He marked the narrow rooftop beside the chimney. It sloped slightly east, toward the alley where the tanners dried their hides. He didn't write any of it down. He didn't need to. By now, his memory was shaped like the city. Later, he passed the chapel. The bell had just rung the hour. Thomas thought it was the 7th, maybe the 8th, and the sound still seemed to hang in the air, soft and distant like the echo of a thought. The chapel was modest, its windows filled not with stained glass, but with oiled cloth stretched tight over old frames. The kind of place where paupers came to pray and old widows brought their aches. He didn't go inside. He never did. But he always stopped to listen. There was something slow and comforting in the way the priest cleared his throat behind the door, in the creak of the step where the mat was worn through, in the rustling of pages being turned slowly, in no hurry at all. Thomas didn't believe, not really. But belief wasn't required to feel the peace of a quiet building, where everyone's voice stayed soft, and the dust moved gently in the candlelight. He stayed there longer than he meant to, not hiding, just resting in the stillness. Then eventually, he moved on. Not far from the chapel, Thomas climbed. It wasn't a dramatic climb, no scaling of towers or leaps between spires, just a quiet shimmy up a stone wall where the ivy had pulled loose some of the mortar, and a slow crawl onto the tiled rooftop of a grain house that never locked its trapdoor. He sat there for a while, legs crossed, a fig in one hand. The city around him hummed softly. A distant cough, a door slammed too hard, a baby crying briefly, then hushed. The wind whispered along the eaves. He chewed slowly. The fig was dry and a bit sour, but it was familiar. And while he sat there, above it all, he could almost pretend to be something else. A chimney sweep, a tired watchman, just another figure wrapped in a cloak against the cold. Below him, the world turned without him. And he liked it that way. The loft above the cooper's barn was warm, dry, and forgotten. Thomas liked it for all the same reasons he liked everything else, because no one thought of it. Not the cooper, who used only the ground floor and never glanced above. Not the animals, who dozed quietly in the stalls below. And not the wind, which whispered past the broken shutters without managing to slip inside. He climbed up late, just as the last shouts from the taverns faded, and settled into the familiar bed of old hay and discarded canvas sacks. It smelled of dust and straw and the faintest memory of apples. Above, the beams were thick with cobwebs. A lone owl perched in the rafters, silent and still. This was not a bed, but it was enough. He didn't light a candle, didn't need to. The moon was high and pale, and its light spilled softly through a knothole in the wall, tracing a silvery thread across the floor. It was, in its own way, beautiful, not grand, just soft and quiet. He lay flat on his back, hands on his stomach, listening. Not for danger, not for footsteps or alarms, just for the city's slow breathing. Below, the oxen shifted once, the heavy thump of their movement muffled by straw. Farther off, he could hear a dog bark and a shutter bang loose. A lull in the wind followed, and then the distant ringing of church bells, half muffled, slowed by the thick air. Hay shifted beneath him with a soft whisper. The rhythm of it reminded him of the sea, though he'd only seen the sea once and briefly. A job near Marseille, a gray sky. Sharp gull cries. A man he didn't meet, but the motion had stayed with him. The slow roll of tide, the way everything in the harbor moved as one. That was how the loft felt now, cradled in something older than noise, older than duty, just the gentle settling of straw and the slow tick of time. It was in places like this and times like now that Thomas sometimes felt the shape of what he'd lost, not grief. He didn't mourn, not in any sharp or dramatic sense. His memories were too worn, too softened by distance to carry sharp edges anymore. But sometimes he remembered things sideways. The sound of a mother singing while peeling root vegetables, the feel of a hand brushing flour from his shoulder, the shape of a name he hadn't heard in years. He didn't dwell on these things. He couldn't afford to. But here, in the warm hush of a forgotten barn, there was no distraction, no movement, no mark to follow. And so the thoughts came, drifting in like dust through a high window. He rolled onto his side, drawing the canvas tighter around his shoulders. Sleep would come, eventually, but not quickly. He didn't resent that. He simply waited. A small mouse rustled in the corner of the loft. Thomas heard it before he saw it. Tiny claws scuffling through the straw, nosing around for seed husks and crumbs. He didn't move. He just watched. The mouse paused now and then, turning its small head as if listening. But it didn't seem afraid. There was nothing threatening in this space. Nothing sharp. Just two quiet creatures sharing the same stillness. The moon had shifted slightly in the sky, and its beam now stretched all the way across the floor, illuminating the mouse for a moment in pale silver. Thomas watched its fur twitch, watched it vanish again into the dark, and felt, strangely, the warmth of its tiny life nearby. So much of his work was about death, the stopping of things, the removal. But this moment wasn't about that. This was about softness, survival, small things, enduring quietly. Eventually, he did sleep. Not deeply, not soundly, but enough. His dreams were not vivid, not wild. They came like watercolors washed in fog. Faded, slow-moving images that didn't ask to be understood. A cart rolling along a dirt path. A woman laughing but without sound. A candle flame bending in the breeze and never quite going out. He didn't dream of violence, never did. His mind didn't need to invent fear. It had known too much of it already. Instead, it clung to the mundane, the peaceful, the things he never had time to savor during daylight hours. A cup of broth, a cat in a window, the feeling of clean linens on a cold night. And when he woke again, an hour, two, he felt only the faint echo of those images, like the aftertaste of something once warm. Before dawn he stirred, not from fear, not from urgency, but because he always did. He sat up slowly, brushing stray bits of hay from his sleeves, and pressed a hand to the cool floorboards. Below, the oxen were rising. He could hear their snorts, the shuffling of hooves, a new day beginning. He stretched, back aching faintly from the stiffness of the boards, and gathered his things, such as they were: the cloth satchel, the waxed roll, a crust of bread wrapped in old linen. He didn't leave right away. He sat at the edge of the loft for a while, legs dangling above the ladder, watching the light change. A soft gray, slowly turning gold at the edges, the shapes of barrels and tools sharpening into form. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. The world below didn't know he'd been there, and that, too, was part of the comfort. Thomas moved through the streets at dawn, his boots soft on the damp stones. The city was still half asleep. Doors remained shut. Market carts stood half covered in oilcloth. A lone candle glimmered in a high window above the tannery, swaying faintly as someone moved past it. The sky had the color of old linen, gray, a little yellow at the edge with no promise of sun. He liked it like this. He didn't need light to see, not the kind others needed. He saw by patterns, by familiarity, where the gutters dipped, where the water collected, which rooftops had loose tiles, where the stray dogs nested under stairs. The city breathed differently in the morning, shallower, slower, and Thomas knew that rhythm as well as his own. He stopped to sit at the end of Plumer's Row, where the crooked chimney of the old bookbinder's house cast long shadows even on clouded days. Thomas liked this spot. The bench was old, its wood gone soft with age, and no one ever asked why. A man might sit there for an hour without speaking. He pulled a crust of bread from his satchel and chewed slowly, watching the square come to life. A man coughed 3 times from the alley beside the printer's shop, same as yesterday. 2 geese waddled past the cooper's yard, arguing in little honks. The apprentice to the chandler dropped his bucket again and picked it up with a sheepish glance to see if anyone had noticed. Thomas noticed. He noticed everything. That was his job, even when there wasn't a job. To watch, to memorize, to disappear into the act of observing. Later in the morning, Thomas moved towards the edge of the green market, not to shop. He didn't shop. He drifted, watching the rhythms of trade, listening to the way haggling rose and fell like ocean waves, noting who was missing, who was new, who seemed suddenly richer than last week, or more desperate. He kept to the edges, not out of fear, but habit. Even here he wasn't Thomas. He was no one, just another man in a hood, slipping past barrels and crates and loud voices. He passed an old woman selling onions tied with twine, a boy half covered in soot, offering small bundles of kindling, a priest without shoes, speaking softly to no one in particular. And Thomas moved through it all like smoke. There were no names, no greetings, only motion. By midday, he had looped through 5 neighborhoods and stopped twice, to watch, never to eat. Once in a narrow alley where rats moved like water between broken crates. Once by the back wall of the guild house, where a new mark of chalk had appeared, a small square with a dot in the center. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but he would find out. because that too was part of the job. Learning the city's secret language, reading it not in letters but in signs, scratches, placement, timing. He knew which walls spoke of smuggling, which doors were safe for an hour, and which were traps. And he never asked questions aloud, because his kind didn't trade in answers, only in silence. Sometimes, when the day stretched long with no one speaking to him, Thomas would imagine names, not his own. He didn't use that, not really, but names for others. The man with the limp might be called Edric. The woman with the faded shawl, perhaps Alna. The boy who always climbed the fountain had a face like a Thomas he had once known. A different Thomas, long gone. It was a quiet game, a way to soften the loneliness that hung around him like his cloak. Because this job, this life, wasn't just danger and secrecy, it was isolation, not loud, just ever-present. You couldn't be known, couldn't be seen, couldn't leave a trail, not even in someone else's mind. So, he gave people names he would never speak, carved tiny stories around them, carried in his head like smooth stones, little weights, little comforts. Later in the afternoon, Thomas stepped into a tavern, not for drink, but for warmth. He didn't sit, just stood near the back wall, near the stairs that led to the rented rooms above. He wouldn't sleep there, he never did. But he liked to listen, the sound of clinking mugs, boots on wood, laughter behind closed doors. He watched the server make her rounds, noted the limp in her step, the way her apron strings had frayed. He watched two merchants argue over dice again, and the same sailor take the same seat as he always did, third from the hearth. The world repeated itself. And in that repetition, Thomas found stability. He stayed for an hour, then left without a word. As dusk approached, the city took on a golden color, but only faintly. The clouds were still there, blurring the light, giving the cobbles a copper sheen. Thomas found a spot near the old fountain. It no longer flowed, but the stone basin was dry and smooth, and good for sitting without being noticed. Children played nearby, not close enough to interact, just visible. They played with a hoop, chased each other's shadows, made up stories and voices he could barely hear. He watched them, eyes half-lidded. There was no bitterness in him, not even envy. He had chosen this path, or been nudged onto it. It didn't matter anymore. But he liked to see laughter, even from a distance, even without being part of it. When Tomas returned to the narrow attic he sometimes called a room, he found a slip of paper tucked under the hinge. It wasn't addressed. It never was. The paper was thick, ragged-edged and soft from wear. A single mark in the center, drawn in soot and spit. A symbol only two people would recognize. It meant tonight, second bell, under stone. Tomas didn't sigh. He didn't react. He simply folded the note once, pressed it into the seam of his sleeve, and set his pack gently on the wooden floor beside the unmade bed. There would be no rest tonight, but then again, there rarely was. Tomas didn't rush. He never rushed. He prepared the way he always did. First, he removed his outer tunic and replaced it with one of rougher weave, darker, easier to lose in shadows. The sleeves were loose but quiet. Then the boots, not soft like noble shoes, but thin enough to feel the earth, and worn enough not to echo. He checked the seams of the satchel he carried. Not for weapons, but for space. 2 wax-sealed packets, 1 cloth-wrapped token, and a dried fig. He might be gone until morning. He slid a knife into his belt, not sharp enough to kill with ease, but more than enough to keep someone back. He didn't expect to use it. He never did. Then he sat for a moment and listened. He always did that too. The wind whistled faintly under the eaves. Below, someone passed, coughing once. A woman this time, older, familiar. Then silence. He rose and disappeared into it. The second bell was the quietest of the night. Not like the raucous first, when inns closed and laughter spilled into streets. Nor like the third, when drunks staggered home. The second bell belonged to those who moved without lanterns, those who didn't knock, those who were known only by shadows and the pressure of unseen steps on wooden stairs. Tomas made his way to the old well beyond the east gate. There, beneath a loosened stone, he would leave the packet. It was always a different stone, always slightly different in appearance. But he knew which one it was tonight. He'd seen the signal scratched faintly on a plaster wall near the Cooper's Lane. A sideways crescent. Nothing more. But it told him what he needed to know. The night was cool, but not cold. A soft, almost pleasant breeze wound between buildings, carrying the scent of apples and chimney smoke. Tomas moved like a ghost. Low, silent, unremarkable. He passed a cart left too near the gutter, stepped over a broken bucket, counted doorways without needing to look. He had lived this route before. By the time he reached the well, the square was empty. The moon hung low and dim. He knelt by the stone, slowly lifted it, and placed the small packet underneath. A folded note with a sealed scrap of parchment beside it. The cloth token he left resting atop it. It would be gone by dawn. He didn't know who took it. That wasn't his concern. His part was simply to deliver and to disappear. After the drop, Tomas didn't go home. He never retraced his steps. Instead, he wandered a different path through the old fishmonger's lane, past the still smoking kiln of the potter's quarter, and down a narrow slope behind the orchard wall. Here, the city was silent in a different way, deeper, sleepier. No light showed in the windows. Only cats moved, their eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through. Tomas felt the rhythm of the place, how it hummed quietly, like a held breath. He passed the spot where an old bootmaker used to sell shoe buttons. The stall was long gone, but he remembered the smell of boiled leather that once filled the space. He passed an old doorway carved with tiny stars, and he passed the place where, long ago, someone had spoken his real name. Just once. Just for a moment. It wasn't a memory he clung to, not a warm one, but it drifted sometimes when the streets grew too quiet. A name spoken aloud, his true one, not Tomas, the one given to him as a boy, the one tied to a family he barely recalled, a village, a fire, a man with rough hands and a voice like gravel. He didn't remember much else, but the name, It flickered now and then. He never spoke it, never wrote it. It belonged to another life, one without stone wells and silent errands, one without code marks and dry fountains. But it was gone now, like the dust that settled between cobblestones, unnoticed, undisturbed. Tomas paused near the abandoned rookery, once a place where messages flew in and out, carried by winged couriers. Now it stood still and broken. Its slats leaned, its tower cracked. But still he visited sometimes, not for nostalgia, but because no one else did. It was a place for stillness. He climbed the first few steps of the tower and sat, just out of view from the path. From here, he could see the rooftops, dark shapes layered like folded cloth, each chimney a slow whisper. He didn't need to do anything now. The message was delivered. There would be no thanks, no payment yet. That came later. This was the part in between, the pause, the breath. This was most of his life, truly. Not tasks or action, but waiting, existing in the gap between moments. He often thought of himself like thread, not the embroidery people saw, but the hidden strand behind the fabric, necessary, but never shown. He didn't resent it. He didn't even think of it much. It was simply how it was. People imagined his life must be full of cunning or blood. But in truth, it was full of silence, of observation, of walking and watching and knowing the feel of a door before it opened. Assassins weren't daggers. They were quiet hours. They were forgotten corners. Eventually, Thomas made his way back, not to the attic from before, but to a second space he kept, deeper in the southern quarter. It wasn't much. A room behind a tanner's shed, above a low bakery that only opened 2 days a week. He let himself in with a key shaped like a broken quill. No light, just smell, damp stone, bread crust, a hint of lime wash. He sat, removed his boots, folded his cloak and set it by the door. There was no candle. He didn't need one. The darkness was familiar. So was the bedroll. He lay down without undressing, folded his hands, listened to the night beyond the shutters, and allowed his thoughts to fade. Sleep came easily, but not deeply. It never did. He never dreamed. Or if he did, the dreams left no trace. He slept like a book closed without a page marked. He slept like a road with no footprints. And when he woke, it would be as if no time had passed at all, because time didn't move in the life he lived. It just hovered and slipped by and forgot his name. When Thomas woke, it was with the pale gray light that filtered in through the cracks between shutters, thin like smoke, barely enough to paint the room. He didn't stir at first. He simply lay still and let the sounds of the early city reach him. Someone was sweeping a step with a birch broom, slow strokes. A distant cart creaked as its axle groaned beneath weight. A rooster crowed, not far off, but muffled behind a stone wall. Morning wasn't loud here. It wasn't bright. It came slowly like ink seeping into the corners of a page. Thomas sat up, rubbed one eye and stood. His boots were still warm from the night before. Behind the small cot was a wooden wall panel. Nothing special to look at. Just pine boards, knotted and uneven. But one of those boards, near the base, had been hollowed slightly, just enough to store 3 things: a strip of cloth, a flint stone wrapped in hide, and a metal ring. The ring was old, too old to wear, bent slightly at the seam. It had been passed to Thomas when he was younger than he could now remember. It had no markings, no inscription, But it had weight, familiarity. It meant wait until the next shadow changes shape. Thomas didn't know who wrote that rule. He didn't question it. He just followed it. He returned the ring, closed the panel, and listened again. Thomas didn't use parchment to find his way. He didn't need to. The map he carried existed in the soles of his feet, in the tilt of roof lines, and the smell of lye and oak bark from the tanner's pit. He walked the city without thought. But if you asked him how many steps from the blacksmith's gate to the back of the nunnery orchard, he'd know. 72. If you asked how many doorways between the spice seller's cart and the alley behind the red stall, he'd tell you 4. And one has a crack in the frame, shaped like a fishbone. The map was not made with ink or compass. It was made with time. It had taken years to build, and he carried it everywhere. Thomas stopped near a baker's stall, an old one, sun-faded, with strips of cloth hung to keep off flies. He didn't go to the front, where coins changed hands. He went around the back. There, under the shelf where broken loaves and crusted heels were tossed, he found what he was looking for. A wedge of barley bread, too stale to sell, wrapped in a page torn from a prayer book, smudged ink, words nearly gone. He sat on a low stone wall and ate in silence, not because he was hiding, but because this was how the message would come. Sometimes it was stitched into the cloth. Sometimes it was inked under the crust. Sometimes, like today, it was tucked in the hollow core of the bread itself. He broke it gently, pulled out the paper, read the 3 words, green lantern, 9th bell. The 9th bell was not literal. In Thomas's world, bells didn't always mean hours. They could mean corners or symbols or secret spaces. In this case, 9th bell meant a stairwell beneath the old watchtower, where 9 rusted nails had been driven into a beam to hold lanterns. Only one lantern ever remained, green glass dented at the base. It hadn't held oil in decades, but behind it, under the wooden bracket, was a tiny hook. And on that hook tonight, Thomas would leave a pouch, not of gold, of truth, a folded list of names, or one name, or perhaps just an initial. It didn't matter what. He never read what he carried. He just knew where it had to go, and when. You might think it would be hard to move unseen, but it wasn't. Not because people didn't watch, but because they only watched what they expected. Thomas never looked hurried, never looked suspicious. He sometimes helped a cartwright lift a wheel, sometimes shared a coin with a beggar, sometimes nodded to a washerwoman as he passed. He was there, but he wasn't noticed. He had become part of the texture. And so even when he carried secrets, tiny, brittle, and dangerous, they passed through the city as unnoticed as a dry leaf in a gutter. The eyes of the city never saw what wasn't loud. And Thomas had never been loud. That afternoon, he stopped in a place where questions weren't asked. A sloped-roofed stable behind an abandoned chapel. The stable had long ceased housing animals, but someone still maintained the roof. Inside, past the last stall, there was a stack of hay that hadn't shifted in weeks. And beneath it, flat, hidden between stones, lay a slip of cloth. It held nothing, but its placement was the message. It meant, don't return to the eastern quarter. Too many eyes. No names, no warnings, just the soft signal of caution. Thomas took it in, folded it, left nothing in return. Sometimes silence was the reply. In one of Thomas's hiding places, there was a mirror, not a real one, just a pane of polished tin, warped with age, mounted in a chipped frame. It didn't show his face clearly, just a vague shape, hints of color, the shadow of a man. He looked at it sometimes, not to see himself, but to remind himself that he still had a face. He wondered what people thought he looked like. To most, he was just the figure that passed behind them in a crowd, the man who bought eggs but never ate them, the hand that passed a coin without a word. His face was not his anymore. It belonged to the work, and the work never smiled. Night fell again, without announcement. No grand sunset, just the light dimming slowly, like a fire smothered with a damp cloth. The lanterns didn't flare. They blinked on, one by one, in doorways and corners. Thomas sat on the edge of a fountain that hadn't held water in years. He waited. He didn't fidget. Didn't look around. He simply waited, hands folded as if part of the stone itself. At ninth bell, he would move, place the pouch, and vanish. But until then, there was nothing. And that was enough. Thomas reached into the lining of his cloak, an old trick he'd been taught before. He could even grow a beard. The seam had been picked apart and re-sewn a dozen times. No thread remained from the original stitching, but it was always in the same place, just beneath the left shoulder, hidden, reachable. From there, he slid out a pouch. It was small, just leather, plain, sewn tightly shut. He didn't know what was inside. He never did. Sometimes it was a letter folded and stained, sometimes a coin, sometimes just a single feather or bead, a message not meant for him. Thomas never looked. He didn't need to know. Knowing was dangerous. He only delivered. The alley was dark now, except for the green lantern. It was not lit. It hadn't been for years. Its iron bracket was bent and the glass pane cracked. But still it hung, tilted just slightly to one side like a tired head leaning into sleep. Thomas reached up, fingers steady, and felt for the tiny nail behind the bracket. The pouch slipped into place with no sound, no tug, no movement. It hung there, invisible in the dimness. No one saw. No one ever did. He stepped back and melted into the shadows like steam into dusk. There was an old rule he'd been taught, passed from elder to youth, faded voice to sharpened ear. Leave with nothing in your hands. Let the air between your fingers be your shield. So Tomas never walked away carrying anything. Not a note, not a trinket, not even food. To walk the night with empty hands was not just safer. It was how he stayed untethered. He wasn't a messenger, not really. He was a whisper that hadn't quite been spoken. He didn't hurry. Thomas's steps were slow, deliberate. The city had fallen asleep, not all of it, but the part that mattered. Bakers were still rising. Rats scurried in gutters. But the part that watched had turned in for the night. That was when he moved best. He passed the gate near the apothecary, the one with 3 missing slats, paused beside the stable door that never latched properly, then turned right, where the street narrowed just wide enough for one person to walk without touching the walls. He knew every crack, every smell, and every time he passed them, he added a layer to his memory, painting his invisible map thicker, truer. Near the edge of the quarter, there was an archway, stone blackened from age and smoke. It had once been a ceremonial gate, but the ceremony had long faded. The city had grown around it, forgotten it. But Thomas remembered, because above the arch, carved in fading Latin, were the words, "Let no man disturb the dust of quiet men." He didn't know who had written it, but he thought of it often. Quiet men. Men who moved without name or footprint, like him. He touched the stone gently, just once, a habit, not a necessity, and walked on. In his room, small, square, and windowless, Thomas kept a lantern. It hadn't held oil in years, but he lit it anyway, not with flame, with memory. He would sit beside it and imagine the glow, not because he liked pretending, but because imagining a light was sometimes more comforting than the light itself. The lantern's body was brass, dented, and the handle had long since rusted away. But in its hollow he kept a single coin, not for spending, just for weight. The sound of it shifting when he moved the lantern reminded him he was still real, still here, still waiting. The hours just before dawn were the softest. No bells rang, no carts rolled, no boots clacked on cobble, only the low murmurs of wind down chimneys, the gentle shift of roof beams. Thomas sat with his back to the wall, knees pulled up slightly, and let the silence soak into him. He thought sometimes about a life where he might have been a tanner, or a weaver, or maybe even a beekeeper, far from the city, listening to the hum of bees instead of the silence of secrets. But thoughts like that had no place in the room, so he folded them away, like unused parchment, and waited. No one ever wrote songs about men like Thomas. No one painted their faces in bright color on chapel ceilings. They weren't remembered in guild records or in town ledgers. Their lives passed like dust. But they had rules and rituals. He sharpened his blade, not to use it, but to remember the edge. He oiled his boots, not because they'd crack, but because soft leather makes no sound. He lit no fire, slept in clothes, ate only when it wouldn't draw attention, and never, not once, called anyone by their real name, not even himself. It was not yet dawn when Thomas slipped into the back alley behind the bakery. The air smelled of flour, not just the dry tickle of it in the air, but the warm kind, rich and clinging. The smell of dough rising in slow, sticky silence. He waited by the wall, where ivy had curled like green thread across the stone. There was no sound but the hush of fire being coaxed awake behind the brick. The baker was already at work. He always was. But it was not the baker Thomas waited for. It was someone else. Someone who no idea. Only by the tilt of their shoulder, the habit of standing slightly pigeon-toed. The door opened. A figure stepped out, cloaked, narrow, and breathing through their nose like someone who had been crying recently. They said nothing. Thomas didn't speak either. That was the rule. Never talk near bread. Too many ears like the comfort of a warm kitchen. The figure stepped forward, handed him something, a crust of bread wrapped in linen, and met his gaze only once. That was the signal. Not the bread, not the time, just the look. It meant, go there, or sometimes, don't return. Thomas nodded once, barely, and turned away. Thomas didn't eat the bread. Not yet. He carried it with care, like a parcel meant for someone else, which it very well might be. He took the long way around, past the well where the old washerwomen gossiped after second bell, past the silent statues by the broken fountain. When he finally sat, he did so beneath the overhang of the cloth dyer's stall. It would be empty until noon. There, out of view, he unwrapped the linen. The bread was fresh, still warm. Inside the fold, tucked gently between the crust and the cloth, a note, but not written, just a symbol, a circle with a cross beneath it. He closed his eyes and tried to remember where he'd seen that before. It would come to him. It always did. Eventually, Thomas wasn't literate in the usual way. He could read street signs and count coins, but not letters. Not really. But he had a different alphabet, one of signs and sigils, marks and whispers, gestures made with a fingertip against a wooden beam. The circle with a cross beneath it meant stay close, or wait for instructions. Or sometimes they're watching. Context was everything. He folded the linen back over the bread and pressed it between his palms, warming it again with body heat. Bread could be eaten, or it could speak. That morning it said, "Not yet." So Thomas waited. One of the hardest lessons Thomas had ever learned was this: doing nothing can be work. Waiting was not idle. It was watching. It was listening. It was holding still when every part of you wanted to shift, stretch, or speak. So he waited. The bread rested beside him, slowly cooling. He watched a crow pick at scraps beside a cart. He watched the shadows stretch as the sun peeked over the church roof. He watched people pass and never see him. Not truly. And he watched his thoughts drift like smoke from a gutter chimney. No one noticed a man who wasn't doing anything. That was his shield. There were people Thomas saw often. The girl with one hand who sharpened knives by the gate. The man with a limp who always fed the stray cats. The old woman who sold dried herbs. Though her stall was almost always empty. He did not know their names. They did not know his. But they saw each other. Sometimes just a glance, sometimes the smallest nod. An invisible society of those who moved at the edges, lived between things and never quite settled. There was comfort in that, a kind of belonging made out of silence. Thomas kept one coin in his boot. It wasn't for spending. It was from a job long past, a payment that had never been handed over, just dropped on a stone sill from a gloved hand. He never used it. In the older quarter of the city, past the butcher's lane, and the square with the broken clock face. There was a cellar that had no shop above it. The buildings around it had crumbled, shifted, or been rebuilt over the centuries. But the steps to the cellar remained, half buried, slick with moss. Invisible unless you already knew to look. Thomas did. He had been using that entry since his first winter in the city. The door didn't creak anymore. He had sanded the hinges with fishbone and oiled them with lamp fat. It swung open soundlessly like a sigh. Inside, darkness, thick and damp and cool. It smelled of mildew, old apples, and forgotten paper. He slipped inside. The door closed. The floor was not stone, but packed dirt, cool and firm beneath Thomas's boots. The air was always still here. No breeze, no light. Only the thick hush of a space that had been sealed too long. He didn't light a torch. He knew the way. Past the barrel filled with empty scroll tubes. Past the crate with dried lavender bunches, long since brittle, their scent faint and dusty. And then, at the far wall, a second door. Low, iron-banded, not locked, just heavy. It opened with a deep breath of cold air, and he stepped down again. Lower, always lower. The lower room had no proper walls, just rough-cut stone, bowed inward by centuries of weight. It had once been a part of a Roman structure, or so Thomas had been told. Now it held a table, just one, wooden, square, chipped at the edges and stained in rings where old oil lamps had burned. And behind it, a stool, also wood. That was where the listener sat, not always the same one, not someone you could name, but someone would be there, sometimes just breathing, sometimes with a piece of charcoal and a square of slate, sometimes with a book they never let Thomas see. He would place whatever he brought on the table. No words, Sometimes he was told to stay. Tonight he was told to stay, not with a word, just the gesture, a flat palm held steady. So he sat. The stool creaked faintly beneath him. The air was cold, but not unfriendly, like the breath of a sleeping cave. The person behind the table did not speak, but they watched. It was a woman tonight. Her eyes were light, maybe gray, maybe blue. It was hard to tell in the low glow of the wick lantern. She held a scrap of parchment, read it silently, then set it aside, and still did not speak. Minutes passed, or perhaps more, and then finally a whisper, "Tomorrow before first bell." That was all. Thomas nodded once and left. Before first bell. That could mean anything. It might be a delivery. It might be a disappearance. It might mean watching someone and leaving no trace that he had done so. Thomas never asked. He simply prepared. He returned to his room, emptied his pockets, removed his boots and scrubbed their soles, changed his cloak for one with no scent, one he kept wrapped in lavender bark for months to blend into noble quarters. He took a small bottle from under the cot, just wax and soot. With it he blackened the skin beneath his eyes, not for vanity, but to disappear in shadow. Some men wore armor. Thomas wore absence. Sleep didn't come. It rarely did before an errand, so he waited, breathing slowly, listening to the faint sounds above him, bells in the far quarter, the low rumble of wagons on the high road, the soft voice of a drunk walking alone. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel much at all, just still, like a book no one had opened. He lay on his side, facing the wall. And when the city began to gray again, and the cocks crowed in the far courtyards, he rose without a sound, ready to be no one again. One of the hardest lessons Thomas had ever learned was this: doing nothing can be work. Waiting was not idle. It was watching. It was listening. It was holding still when every part of you wanted to shift, stretch, or speak. So he waited. The bread rested beside him, slowly cooling. He watched a crow pick at scraps beside a cart. He watched the shadows stretch as the sun peeked over the church roof. He watched people pass and never see him, not truly. And he watched his thoughts drift like smoke from a gutter chimney. No one noticed a man who wasn't doing anything. That was his shield. There were people Thomas saw often. The girl with one hand who sharpened knives by the gate. The man with a limp who always fed the stray cats. The old woman who sold dried herbs. Though her stall was almost always empty. He did not know their names. They did not know his. But they saw each other. Sometimes just a glance, sometimes the smallest nod. An invisible society of those who moved at the edges, lived between things and never quite settled. There was comfort in that, a kind of belonging made out of silence. Thomas kept one coin in his boot. It wasn't for spending. It was from a job long past, a payment that had never been handed over, just dropped on a stone sill from a gloved hand. He never used it. In the older quarter of the city, past the butcher's lane, and the square with the broken clock face. There was a cellar that had no shop above it. The buildings around it had crumbled, shifted, or been rebuilt over the centuries. But the steps to the cellar remained, half buried, slick with moss. Invisible unless you already knew to look. Thomas did. He had been using that entry since his first winter in the city. The door didn't creak anymore. He had sanded the hinges with fishbone and oiled them with lamp fat. It swung open soundlessly like a sigh. Inside, darkness, thick and damp and cool. It smelled of mildew, old apples, and forgotten paper. He slipped inside. The door closed. The floor was not stone, but packed dirt, cool and firm beneath Thomas's boots. The air was always still here, no breeze, no light. Only the thick hush of a space that had been sealed too long. He didn't light a torch. He knew the way. Past the barrel filled with empty scroll tubes. Past the crate with dried lavender bunches, long since brittle, their scent faint and dusty. And then, at the far wall, a second door. Low, iron-banded, not locked, just heavy. It opened with a deep breath of cold air, and he stepped down again. Lower, always lower. The lower room had no proper walls, just rough-cut stone, bowed inward by centuries of weight. It had once been a part of a Roman structure, or so Thomas had been told. Now it held a table, just one, wooden, square, chipped at the edges and stained in rings where old oil lamps had burned. And behind it, a stool, also wood. That was where the listener sat, not always the same one, not someone you could name, but someone would be there, sometimes just breathing, sometimes with a piece of charcoal and a square of slate, sometimes with a book they never let see. He would place whatever he brought on the table. No words, then leave. Sometimes he was told to stay. Tonight he was told to stay, not with a word, just the gesture, a flat palm held steady. So he sat. The stool creaked faintly beneath him. The air was cold, but not unfriendly, like the breath of a sleeping cave. The person behind the table did not speak, but they watched. It was a woman tonight. Her eyes were light, maybe gray, maybe blue. It was hard to tell in the low glow of the wick lantern. She held a scrap of parchment, read it silently, then set it aside, and still did not speak. Minutes passed, or perhaps more, and then finally a whisper, tomorrow before first bell. That was all. Thomas nodded once and left. Before first bell. That could mean anything. It might be a delivery. It might be a disappearance. It might mean watching someone and leaving no trace that he had done so. Thomas never asked. He simply prepared. He returned to his room, emptied his pockets, removed his boots and scrubbed their soles, changed his cloak for one with no scent, one he kept wrapped in lavender bark for months to blend into noble quarters. He took a small bottle from under the cot, just wax and soot. With it he blackened the skin beneath his eyes, not for vanity, but to disappear in shadow. Some men wore armor. Thomas wore absence. Sleep didn't come. It rarely did before an errand. So he waited, breathing slowly, listening to the faint sounds above him, bells in the far quarter, the low rumble of wagons on the high road, the soft voice of a drunk walking alone. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel much at all, just still, like a book no one had opened. He lay on his side, facing the wall. And when the city began to gray again, and the cocks crowed in the far courtyards, he rose without a sound, ready to be no one again. Thomas rarely went to the upper city. It was clean there, not in a moral sense, but literally. Swept streets, water buckets on every corner, and guards with polished boots. He didn't like it, but the note had said, before first bell. And he knew what that meant, when combined with the bread, the glance, and the lantern signal from 2 days before. A window drop, not even a delivery. Just something placed. Something so ordinary that no one would ever remember it had been there. He walked slowly, not sneaking. That would draw attention. Instead, he became invisible by becoming unimportant. The kind of man whose errands were too dull to notice. It was on the third story of a merchant's house, not especially tall, but taller than most. There were red clay tiles on the roof, though many were chipped. The window itself was nothing, narrow, wooden framed, with leaded glass that bowed slightly in the center. But it had no shutter latch, and that was the detail that mattered. Thomas waited in the alley behind the house, beside a pile of straw sacks that smelled faintly of old turnips. He counted to 60, then another 60. When the milk cart passed, as it always did at first light, he moved. Up the drain pipe, across the corner beam, toes pressed gently into the brickwork. Silent, effortless, forgettable. He reached the ledge and crouched low, one hand steadying him on the stone. From beneath his cloak, he took a small cloth bundle, no larger than a bread roll, wrapped in linen, tied in twine. Inside, 3 pressed herbs, a flat coin with no markings, and a feather blackened with ink. None of it made sense. Not to him, but it wasn't meant to. His job was only to place it. He set it in the corner of the window ledge, tilted just so, as instructed, not centered, not hidden, just there. Then, without pausing, he climbed down again, just in time to vanish behind a fish cart. The parcel was never touched. That was the point. Thomas didn't know who had told him to do it. That was not unusual. Often, instructions came through third hands, fourth hands, or not at all. Just signs and signals like the bread, the eye contact, the oil lantern tilt. He didn't need to know. He didn't want to know. Knowing was dangerous. Knowing meant you could speak by accident. Better to be a hand, not a head. Better to do than to understand. And yet, there were times when Thomas wondered if the jobs were even real, if the little parcels ever mattered, if the signals were more than a game. Sometimes he felt like a leaf caught in someone else's wind. That afternoon, Thomas walked to the older side of the river, where the moss grew high on the city wall. There he found an alcove, one of many. Once it had been a guard station. Now it was nothing. He sat and ran his fingers over the smooth stone of the wall. There was something strange about it, too polished, not like the others, as if someone had rubbed it for years, or as if something had once been carved there and had been scraped away. He didn't know why he noticed it, but it stayed with him. Sometimes the absence of a thing was louder than its presence. Later that week, Thomas received a wax-sealed scrap. It was left beneath a loose brick behind the grain store. The seal was unmarked. He melted it off with the tip of a candle and read the single line inside. Vault room, west cloister, before moonrise. That was all. The west cloister was part of the old abbey ruins, mostly abandoned now except for the pigeons and 2 sleeping dogs. But Thomas knew what vault room meant. It didn't hold treasure. It held parchment, records, ledgers no one ever opened. He went just before sunset, cloaked in a dusky brown that blended with the stone. No one saw him. They never did. Inside, the air was dry and stale. Dozens of shelves stacked with scrolls, slates, crumbling ledgers. Thomas moved softly between them, looking not for something, but for where something wasn't. The gap, the place recently disturbed. There, he found it. A scroll only half returned to its niche. He slid it out and unrolled it slowly. Names, dates, pay owed. He did not read them. He merely checked the markings. He found the symbol, a small cross beside a name written twice. He took a charcoal stub from his pouch and added a second cross, then rolled it back. Done. Nothing more. He didn't know whose name it was, didn't want to. The cross he marked might mean confirmation or cancellation or payment owed. But Thomas didn't ask. He simply made the mark. It was perhaps the smallest act he ever performed on a job. Just a flick of charcoal. But it weighed heavier than most. It felt like closing a door he'd never opened. He left without looking back. The vault room returned to silence, as if no one had been there at all. That night, Thomas crossed the bridge back to the lower quarter. The bridge was stone, worn smooth by centuries of steps. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was blessed. Thomas thought it was just old. He paused halfway, looked out over the black water. Reflected in it, the city shimmered, its torches, its windows, its towers, all upside down, all silent. He touched the coin in his boot and thought briefly about the first time he had ever crossed that bridge. He couldn't remember what had brought him then, only that he hadn't gone back. The next signal came in the form of thread. Thomas noticed it as he passed the old weaver's cart near St. Lena's Gate. A red thread, not bright but deep, like dried berries, tied in a double loop around one of the spokes. It was small, most would miss it. But Thomas had been told long ago, red thread means pause, double knot means watch. So he paused and watched. He leaned against the wall beside the gatehouse and listened to the sounds of the market waking up. The cart stayed empty. No one approached it. But a beggar with no shoes lingered near the corner longer than usual. He looked up, caught Thomas's eye, and nodded. Once, then left. That was the message. The job wasn't now, but it was near. There was a language in fabric. It wasn't written, it wasn't spoken. It was in how a scarf was folded, or which corner of a tablecloth was turned. The guilds used it to mark taxes. The churches used it to signal feasts. And the hidden ones, like Thomas, used it to pass meaning without ink. Thread color, thread direction, placement. The cloak he wore that day had 2 seams double-stitched in copper thread, a sign that he was available, but not open. A signal not meant to be seen unless you were looking very closely, and someone had seen. He could feel it. That meant the next message was already waiting. Thomas returned to his lodging by way of the Seeker's Row. He didn't need bread, but he was looking for a sign. The 4th stall from the gate was run by a woman who never spoke. She always had exactly 8 loaves of bread on her board, but when one was missing its crust, it meant something was hidden beneath it. Today, the 2nd loaf was bare on top. Thomas handed over a coin, took the loaf, nodded politely. He didn't break it open until he was alone, back in his small stone room. Inside the bread, a folded scrap of waxed cloth. Inside that, a dry sprig of rue, a fish scale, and a circle inked in ash. Not instructions, a destination. The fish scale meant the southern wharf. The rue meant dawn. The circle, someone knew. There was a place near the southern wharf where no boats moored. The water there was shallow and thick with reeds. No one fished it. No one lived nearby. But sometimes, when the work called for it, Thomas found messages buried beneath the old nets, tucked inside rotting barrels, or even carved into the stone pilings. This morning he found a basket. Simple, woven, empty, except for a pebble the size of a thumb. Smooth, and painted with a single black dot. Someone had been there, left it for him. But what did it mean? It meant wait, so he did. As the sun climbed just high enough to lighten the mist, a dog appeared. It wasn't remarkable, a brown mongrel with tattered ears and one eye clouded white. But it walked with purpose. It didn't sniff, didn't search. It just walked to Thomas, stopped and stared, then turned and walked away. It paused once to look back, so Thomas followed, down a path of crushed shells and salt grass, around a ruined gatehouse, into a cluster of buildings no longer in use. There, beside a cracked stone trough, the dog sat and waited. Behind the trough, a sack. Inside the sack, clothes, dry bread, and a sealed wax tablet. No note, just the tools. Thomas took them and left. The dog didn't follow. Back in his room, Thomas lit a candle. The wax tablet was unmarked on the outside, but inside, once warmed gently, the message revealed itself, not with words, but with symbols. 4 of them: a tree, a hook, a crescent, a gate. Thomas had seen this code before. It was old. It dated back to when he first joined years ago. It meant, observe the watcher, do not be seen, do not interrupt. A watcher meant someone else was doing the real work. He was just to make sure they weren't watched themselves. He was to watch the watcher and remain a shadow. The message pointed him to the far end of the town, near the old orchard wall. There was a tree there, half dead, leaning sideways, barely more than a stump now. Thomas arrived just before dusk. The watcher was already there. She sat beneath the tree, her face turned toward the merchant road. She had a basket of herbs and a pair of shears. No one passing by would think anything of her, just an old herbalist waiting for her ride, but Thomas could tell. Her posture was too still, her eyes too focused. He settled into the ditch nearby, hidden by thistle and shadow, and waited. For 2 hours, nothing changed. The woman didn't move. The road remained quiet. A cart passed, its wheels creaking. A boy on a mule rode by, singing to himself. The wind shifted, and still, nothing happened. Tomas didn't mind. This was the kind of task he preferred. No blood, no questions, just presence. Stillness was his strength. And in time, the moment ended. The woman stood, brushed dust from her knees, and walked off the road toward the orchard path. She had not acted, which meant he had nothing more to do. He waited until the light was gone, then vanished into the night. The seasons were changing. The wind that drifted across the rooftops carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the faint, distant smell of wood smoke. In the quiet upper rooms of the candlemaker's house, Tomas sat alone by the window. A single flame flickered beside him in a small clay dish. The wax was poor, the light weak, but it was enough to read by. Not that he was reading. He simply sat, watching the breeze tug gently at the corner of a shutter, and listened to the sounds of the city easing into night. The clatter of hooves on stone, the distant song of a boy returning home from the tavern, the soft bark of a dog, answered by another far away. And then silence, no assignments, no symbols in the bread, no threads tied to wheels, just quiet. Long ago, when he was still new to this life, Thomas had started keeping a list, not of names, never names, candles, each person he'd watched, each job he'd done, each passing shadow he'd witnessed, but not spoken of. They all got a candle. He never said why, just that it helped. He carved a single notch into the wood of the candle holder for each, small, shallow, hidden beneath the base. The old candle holder was nearly full now, not from violence, but from observation, the kind of life that required long hours of silence and short moments of decision. And when the work slowed, as it now had, he looked at the notches, let his fingers run across them, and remembered how many people had never known they were seen. That was the trade. He saw, others didn't. And for that, he remained unknown. The woman with the herb basket never came back. He
He'd seen her only once under the crooked tree, and yet she lingered in his memory like a half-forgotten tomb. Sometimes when he passed the orchard road, he'd glance toward the tree, still standing, still crooked, still alone. The basket never returned either. Maybe she'd left. Maybe she'd simply gone somewhere else, somewhere else. That was how it went. You didn't say goodbye, you just changed direction. You vanished quietly into another name, another task, another face in the crowd. Awake, still still silent, still solemn. But now, the bread always had crust, no messages, no folded scraps, tucked inside one window. Still, it must be the left one's what? Awake which one? Awake the bread must be the scent of flour and ash, the soft crackle as he tore it open. Nothing inside was comfortable. A reminder of something that used to be. He wasn't sure if he missed the messages or simply felt them unnecessary. The way the bread stayed crusted, the silence stayed haunted. There were some pigeons, small gray ones, puffed up, speckless, and small squirrels, high and flying. Always the same type of parchment, always the same thing twined. He hadn't had one in 6 months. He still kept the cage, still left out water and pages sealed, just in case. Pigeons, like people, sometimes stop returning. The rooftops were quieter now. There was nothing to expect, and no one answered. He'd known that. He knew it. The way the notes had changed the mood, the rusted hinge, the way it came before there was some large somersault. This was a quiet one. Once not long ago, Lull had approached him in the stables, young, with the kind of eyes that hadn't seen war for yet. He handed Tora some faded slip of parchment, said nothing, and left. But it wasn't sealed. Inside, a name and a code. The name was unfamiliar, but the handwriting wasn't. Thomas looked at it for a long time, then folded it open, left the room along where it stood, and walked away. It was the first job he ever refused. Not because it was too difficult, not because it was unworthy, but because it felt like a thread pulling the wrong way, like a knot tied too tightly. Sometimes the answer was no. He would let letters down then, to people he didn't know, to names he heard once and never again. He didn't sign them, didn't mail them, simply wrote. He wrote paper neatly, and placed the envelopes so nothing could know it was wrong. Small ritual, private, personal. Some people prayed, some people said, "Please write to ghosts." And the ghosts never replied. He kept a small satchel packed with always ready. Contained a spare fork, a handful of coins, a small knife, a piece of thread, red, but not knotted, not a sign for anyone else, just a reminder of what once was. He never moved it, never unpacked it.
Even when he cleaned the room or changed the linens, it stayed quietly beside the door. Not for escape, not for flight, just for the idea that maybe, someday, someone might need the person he once was. And if they did, he'd still remember how to be him. There were weeks when he didn't speak, not to another soul, not even to himself. The world didn't ask anything of him, and so he gave it nothing. He tended a small window garden, herbs mostly. He watched the sky. He listened to the bells from the chapel, though he never went inside. Sometimes he heard laughter from the tavern and smiled faintly, though he couldn't recall the last time he'd laughed himself. Stillness had become his companion, and in its gentle, quiet way, It kept him whole. Thomas no longer slept with a dagger under his pillow, no longer tied bells to the door, no longer left a pinch of dust on the floorboards to see if anyone had entered. He simply slept, not deeply, but without fear. He had earned nothing, but had lost little. And that, in the end, was enough. He did not dream. But sometimes, in that floating space between wakefulness and rest, he remembered the smell of the sea, the feel of a rope in his hand, the warmth of the stone wall beneath his back as he watched someone walk by, unaware they'd been seen. It was a small room, but it was his, and it was quiet now. One evening, he lit a final candle. There was no message, no signal, no job, just the candle and the sound of the wind outside. He sat beside it, closed his eyes. No cloak, no disguise, no hidden knife, all Thomas, a man no longer a shadow. And for the first time in many years, there was nothing else to do. No more watching, no more waiting, only silence and sleep.